Most people experience the world through their eyes. I experience it through the soles of my feet and the frequency in my ears. When you spend 15 years in the heart of a regional power grid, you develop a sense that doesn't exist in medical textbooks. It's a sixth sense for entropy. My name is Adam. At Nexus Energy, I wasn't just a senior load dispatcher, I was the guy who negotiated with the laws of physics every night so that 4 million people could sleep in the light. The command center was my cathedral. It was a cavernous, windowless room in the subbasement of the Nexus headquarters, cooled to a constant 68 degrees to keep the massive server banks from melting. The wall in front of me was a 60-foot mosaic of glowing neon lines, the synoptic map. It tracked the flow of electricity across 3 states. Green lines meant health. Yellow meant strain. Red meant someone was about to lose their job, or their life. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in mid-August. The humid heat of the Midwest had been sitting on the city like a wet wool blanket for 6 days. Air conditioners were humming in every bedroom, every office building, every hospital. The grid was breathing heavy. Adam, check the harmonic resonance on the east-west entity, Leo said, his voice cracking slightly. Leo was my best junior tech, sharp, but he relied too much on the digital readouts. He didn't know how to listen to the machines yet. I feel it, Leo, I said, my feet resting on the floor. I could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration through the concrete. It was offbeat. It was a stutter. The AI says we're within tolerance, Leo argued, pointing to his screen. 60.01 Hz. Steady as a rock. The AI is averaging the data over 10-second intervals, I said, standing up and walking to the master console. It's missing the micro spikes. Look at the subcycle wave. I punched a series of commands into the manual override. The screen zoomed in, revealing a jagged, sawtooth pattern in the frequency. The grid wasn't steady, it was shivering. The Gibson Substation, I whispered. Gibson? That's a Tier 1 hub, Leo gasped. If Gibson trips, the whole northern loop cascades. But the sensors there say the oil temperature in the transformers is normal. The sensors are lying because the cooling pumps are cavitating, I explained, already grabbing the secure phone line. The heat has caused an air bubble in the line. The sensor is reading the air, not the oil. In 5 minutes, that transformer is going to turn into a $4 million fireball. I didn't wait for a manager. I didn't call a committee. In the old Nexus, I didn't have to. I had absolute operational authority. I dialed the night manager at the Mid-State Steel Mill, our largest industrial consumer. Frank, it's Adam at Nexus. I need you to drop 200 megawatts. Now. Adam? Are you crazy? We're mid-pour on the furnace. If I drop now, the slag ruins the mold. That's a 6-figure loss. Frank, if you don't drop in the next 60 seconds, the Gibson hub explodes. If that happens, your mill stays dark for 3 weeks, not 3 hours. I'll credit you double the demand response rate on your next bill. Move. I hung up and watched the map. 30 seconds passed. 40. Then, a massive green block on the map, the steel mill, turned gray. The load dropped. The shivering on my screen smoothed out instantly. The vibration in the floor stopped. Now, I said to Leo, dispatch a crew to Gibson. Tell them to bleed the air from the pump line on transformer 4. And tell them to bring a fire extinguisher, just in case. Leo stared at the screen, then at me. How did you know? The software didn't trigger an alarm for another 6 minutes. Software knows what has happened, I said, sitting back down. A dispatcher knows what is happening. There's a ghost in this machine, Leo. You have to learn its language. 2 hours later, the sun began to peek over the horizon. The crisis was over. The city was waking up, flipping on coffee makers and toasters, completely unaware that they had been 60 seconds away from a 3-day blackout. At 9 a.m., the elevator doors opened. Bill, the CEO, walked in. He was a man who started his career climbing poles in the middle of thunderstorms. He had grease under his fingernails and a brain like a calculator. Adam, Bill said, leaning over my console. I saw the log. Gibson? Gibson, I confirmed. Air pocket in the coolant line. Frank at the mill helped us out. Bill nodded, patting my shoulder with a hand that felt like a brick. Good catch. I'll make sure the board knows why we're paying Frank's response credit. You probably saved us $10 million in hardware and litigation today. Just another Tuesday, Bill. Not for long, Bill said, his face darkening slightly. The board is meeting this afternoon. They're finalized the succession plan. I'm retiring in October, Adam. A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. Who are they bringing in? Someone from operations? Bill shook his head. No. They want modernization. They want efficiency. They're bringing in a turnaround specialist from a private equity firm. Her name is Evelyn Thorne. A turnaround specialist? I asked. For a company that's already profitable and has 99.9% uptime? They don't want uptime anymore, Adam, Bill sighed. They want margins. They think our expertise is too expensive. They think the ghost can be replaced by a subscription service. I looked at the map. The neon green lines were pulsing, beautiful and steady. For 15 years, I had protected this system. I had stayed up through hurricanes, blizzards, and heat waves. I had treated every transformer like a child and every megawatt like a heartbeat. She's coming for the experts, isn't she? I asked. Bill didn't answer. He just looked at the map one last time, turned, and walked toward the elevator. That was the last time I saw a CEO who understood what we did. The next time those elevator doors opened for a leadership visit, the air in the room didn't just get colder, it died. Evelyn Thorne was coming, and she didn't care about the frequency of the grid. She only cared about the frequency of the zeros on her bonus check. And I was about to find out exactly how much my magic was worth in her world. If Bill was a sledgehammer, heavy, blunt, and reliable, Evelyn Thorne was a scalpel. But she wasn't the kind of scalpel a surgeon uses to heal, she was the kind a hitman uses to disappear a witness. She arrived at Nexus Energy on a Monday that felt more like a funeral than a corporate transition. The air in the command center, usually filled with the comfortable, low-frequency hum of high-voltage data, suddenly felt thin. Brittle. When the elevator doors slid open at 10 a.m., the sound wasn't the usual heavy thud of Bill's work boots. It was the rhythmic, predatory click-clack of 4-inch stilettos on the polished concrete. Evelyn Thorne didn't wear a high-visibility vest or carry a hard hat. She wore a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my first 2 cars combined. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, and her eyes, a piercing, icy blue, didn't look at the grid map with wonder. They looked at it like a hunter looks at a carcass, calculating which parts to keep and which to throw to the dogs. Beside her stood Julian, a man in his late 20s who looked like he had been grown in a lab specifically to annoy engineers. He carried a slim titanium tablet and wore a smirk that suggested he knew something you didn't, even though he couldn't tell a capacitor from a cupcake. They didn't go to the CEO's office. They came straight to the floor. Evelyn stopped behind my console. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask about the Gibson crisis from the week before. She simply stared at the monitors for 30 seconds before speaking. "The redundancy in this sector is inefficient," she said. Her voice was a flat, mid-Atlantic drawl that lacked any trace of human warmth. I didn't turn around immediately. I finished logging a load shift for the Western Corridor, then pivoted my chair. "It's not redundancy, Ms. Thorne. It's a failsafe. In the event of a solar flare or a localized surge, those lines prevent a total blackout." She looked at me then, her eyes tracking the gray in my beard and the faded Nexus logo on my polo shirt. "And you are?" "Adam. Senior load dispatcher. 15 years. "Ah, yes. The invisible architect," she said, the nickname sounding like an insult in her mouth. "Julian, what does the Sentinel AI say about this sector?" Julian tapped his tablet with a manicured finger. "The Sentinel model suggests we can run this sector at 95% capacity with only 2 active subloops, ma'am. Decommissioning the third would save $1.2 million annually in maintenance and staffing." "The AI is based on ideal conditions, Julian," I interjected, my voice level but firm. "We don't live in ideal conditions. We live in a state where the wind can hit 90 miles per hour and the temperature can swing 40 degrees in 6 hours. That third loop is the only reason the hospitals in the north side didn't go dark during the 2022 heatwave." Evelyn leaned in, her perfume, something that smelled like cold lilies and ozone, hitting me. "Mr. Adam, you are a legacy thinker. You operate on feel and history. This company is moving toward a data-driven future. Data doesn't get tired. Data doesn't ask for overtime. And most importantly, data doesn't rely on hunches." She turned on her heel and began walking the perimeter of the room, Julian trailing behind her like a faithful shadow. She pointed at the break room, where we kept the coffee that fueled our 30-hour shifts. "Close it," she snapped. "Install a vending machine. And these desks, they take up too much square footage. We can fit 6 efficiency pods in this space." Leo, sitting at the station next to mine, looked at me with pure terror. He was young enough to be worried about his mortgage but old enough to know that Evelyn Thorne was the kind of person who would fire her own mother to increase a quarterly dividend by 0.5%. Over the next 2 weeks, the Thorne era began in earnest. It started with the optimization audits. Every engineer, every technician, every dispatcher was hauled into a windowless room on the 42nd floor. Not to talk about safety or grid integrity, but to justify their existence. They didn't ask about my Gibson catch. They asked about my utilization rate. They asked why I needed 4 monitors when the AI could summarize the data on 1. I watched as the old guard began to disappear. First, it was Miller, the head of maintenance. He'd been with the company for 30 years. He knew the location of every buried cable in the tri-state area without looking at a map. He was replaced by a third-party service contract with a company out of Texas that promised to do the work for 40% less. Then it was Sarah, our safety compliance officer. Her role was absorbed into a digital portal where employees were expected to self-report violations. The command center, once a place of camaraderie and high-stakes focus, became a silent, paranoid tomb. We stopped talking. We stopped sharing hunches. We just stared at our screens, waiting for the axe to fall. The tension peaked on a Thursday afternoon. The weather was clear, the grid was stable, but the internal atmosphere was lightning-charged. Julian had spent the morning standing behind Leo, taking notes on a clipboard every time Leo checked a manual gauge. "Why are you checking the analog pressure, Leo?" Julian asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "The digital feed is right there." "The digital feed has a 4-second lag, Julian," Leo muttered, his hands shaking slightly. "The analog is real-time." 4 seconds is statistically insignificant in a stabilized environment, Julian said, scribbling on his pad. "Your manual habits are creating cognitive friction. It's inefficient." I was about to snap, to tell Julian exactly where he could stick his cognitive friction, when my desk phone rang. It wasn't the internal line. It was the executive assistant's line. "Adam? Ms. Thorne would like to see you. Now. Bring your personal identification and your security fob." The room went silent. Leo looked at me, his face pale. He knew what bring your fob meant. In the corporate world, that was the equivalent of being told to walk toward the guillotine. I stood up. I didn't pack anything. I didn't look at Leo. I just straightened my Nexus shirt, the one with the logo I used to be proud of, and walked toward the elevator. As I stepped inside, I saw Julian take my chair. He didn't even wait for the doors to close. He just sat in my seat, placed his tablet on my desk, and started swiping away at the life I had built over 15 years. The elevator climbed to the 42nd floor in total silence. I watched the numbers go up, feeling the pressure change in my ears. I thought about the thousands of nights I'd spent in the basement. I thought about the storms I'd fought. I thought about the ghost in the machine. When the doors opened, the executive floor was quiet. No hum of electricity here. Just the soft muffled sound of thick carpets and the smell of expensive furniture. Evelyn Thorne was sitting behind her desk, framed by a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city. The city I kept running. The city that was currently humming at exactly 60 hertz because of the protocols I had written. She didn't look up from her laptop. "Sit down, Adam," she said. I didn't sit. I stood in front of her desk, my hands behind my back. "You asked for my fob, Evelyn. Let's not waste time with a chair." She finally looked up. A thin, predatory smile touched her lips. I like directness. It's efficient. But you're wrong, I didn't bring you here to fire you. Not yet. She pushed a manila folder across the desk. It looked exactly like the one the CEO had pushed across the desk in the script I'd read once. It was the compensation realignment. We've finished our audit of the dispatch division, she said. Your expertise is noted. However, your salary is a significant outlier. To bring Nexus in line with industry benchmarks, we are implementing a mandatory salary adjustment. I opened the folder. The number was staring back at me like a cold dead eye. Minus 20%. 20%? I whispered. After 15 years? After Gibson? After the 2022 heatwave? Those are past performances, Adam, she said, leaning back. In the private equity world, we don't pay for the past. We pay for the future value. And the future is automated. You have 48 hours to sign the new agreement. If you don't, we will begin the transition phase for your role immediately. And the office move? I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Ah, yes. The logistics annex. Near the garage. Since Julian will be taking over the strategic oversight of the command floor, we feel your operational experience would be better utilized overseeing the fleet maintenance schedules. The senior load dispatcher. The man who held the heartbeat of the state. She wanted me to count oil filters in a basement next to the diesel mechanics. I looked out the window at the city. The lights were on. For now. 48 hours, I said. 48 hours, she confirmed. I turned and walked out. I didn't take the folder. I didn't need it. I already knew the only number that mattered, 0. Which was exactly how much loyalty I had left for Nexus Energy. The drive home that evening felt like a journey through a city I no longer recognized. I looked at the streetlights, thousands of sodium vapor eyes staring down at the asphalt, and all I could think about was that they were powered by a company that had just told me I was worth 20% less than I was yesterday. Every 15 years, a man builds a version of himself. He builds a reputation, a lifestyle, and a sense of security. Evelyn Thorne hadn't just cut my pay, she had taken a serrated blade to the foundation of who I was. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled of rosemary and roasted chicken. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen, her medical scrub still on, humming a tune while she plated dinner. My son, Toby, was at the kitchen table, buried in a physics textbook. It was a scene of hard-earned middle-class peace. A peace that was about to be shattered. You're late, Sarah said, smiling as she looked up. Then her smile faltered. She had spent a decade in emergency rooms, she could read trauma before the patient even spoke. Adam? What happened? Was there a surge? Worse, I said, dropping my bag by the door. There was an audit. I sat down and told them. I told them about the folder, the 20% cut, and the logistics annex by the garage. I watched Sarah's face go from confusion to white-hot anger. 20%? She whispered. That's not a realignment, Adam. That's a move to force you out. They want you to quit so they don't have to pay severance. I know, I said. But Toby's tuition for the hockey academy is due next month. The mortgage reset is in 6 months. If I walk, we have maybe 90 days of runway. Toby looked up from his book, his eyes wide. Are we going to lose the house, Dad? No, I said, perhaps too quickly. No, Toby. I'll figure it out. I always do. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure. The next 48 hours were a psychological blur. I went back to Nexus, but I wasn't allowed on the command floor. My badge had already been reprofiled. When I swiped at the glass doors of the cathedral I had guarded for 15 years, the light turned red. A soft, electronic chirp told me I was no longer welcome in the room where I knew every bolt and wire. A security guard, a guy named Mike who I'd shared 1,000 midnight pizzas with, looked at me with genuine pity. Sorry, Adam. Orders from the 42nd floor. You've been relocated to Annex B. Annex B was a concrete box at the far end of the equipment yard. It was where they stored old transformers, rusted spools of copper, and the fleet of service trucks. My office was a laminate desk shoved between a rack of industrial tires and a leaking water cooler. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and damp cardboard. I sat there for 8 hours, staring at a computer that was so old it struggled to open a basic spreadsheet. I was the senior load dispatcher of the tri-state area, and my new job was inventory reconciliation of fleet consumables. I was counting spark plugs. The humiliation was intentional. It was a stress test. Evelyn Thorne wanted to see how much I would swallow before I choked. That night, I did something I promised I would never do. I reached out to my brother-in-law, Gary. Gary was a disruptor. He flipped luxury real estate and wore gold watches that were louder than his personality. He had always viewed my job at Nexus as glorified maintenance. To him, if you weren't scaling or leveraging, you weren't working. We met at a high-end steakhouse he chose specifically because he knew it would be a stretch for me. So, Gary said, slicing into a piece of Wagyu that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. The invisible architect finally hit a ceiling. I told you years ago, Adam. You're a cog. Cogs get replaced when the machine gets an upgrade. I'm not a cog, Gary. I'm the guy who keeps the machine from exploding. I need a bridge loan. Just until I find a lead role at a different utility. 6 months, tops. Gary laughed, a dry, sharp sound. Alone? Adam, you're 41. Your legacy. The market is moving to AI and green tech startups. Who's going to hire a guy who specializes in fixing 50-year-old cold grid harmonics? You're a dinosaur watching the meteor hit. I have expertise no software can replicate, I snapped. Expertise is just a fancy word for expensive, Gary countered, leaning in. Tell you what. I need a property manager for my new complex in the North End. It's mostly dealing with clogged toilets and angry tenants. I'll give you 60 grand a year. It's a pay cut, sure, but dinosaurs can't be choosers. I looked at Gary, the man who Sarah had grown up with, the man who was supposed to be family, and I saw the same cold, calculating light in his eyes that I saw in Evelyn Thorne's. To them, the world wasn't built on service or skill, it was built on who was holding the leash. I'll pass, I said, standing up. Suit yourself, Gary called after me. But don't come crying when the bank starts calling. Sarah deserves better than a guy who's too proud to admit he's obsolete. I walked out into the cool night air. The city was glowing. The Nexus grid was holding steady. I looked up at the 42nd floor of the Nexus building, visible from the street. One window was still lit. Evelyn's. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to sign that folder on Friday morning and accept my place in the basement, grateful for the crumbs she left on the plate. I drove home in total silence. Sarah was waiting for me on the porch. She didn't ask how it went with Gary. She saw my face and just held out a glass of water. We have 3 months of savings, she said quietly. I know. And I can pick up double shifts at the clinic. It'll be hard on Toby, but we can do it. I looked at her. I'm not signing it, Sarah. If I sign that paper, I'm agreeing that 15 years of my life were a mistake. I'm agreeing that the ghost doesn't matter. Then don't sign it, she said, her voice like iron. Let them see what happens when the architect leaves the building. Friday morning arrived. The deadline was 9 a.m. I didn't go to Annex B. I went to the 42nd floor. I didn't have my fob, so I waited at the security desk until Evelyn's assistant came down. Ms. Thorne is expecting your signed agreement, the assistant said, holding out a hand. I didn't give her an agreement. I gave her an envelope containing my physical keys, my company ID, and a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a resignation letter filled with corporate fluff. It was a notice of material breach. I had spent the entire night reading the company's bylaws. I found a clause Bill had inserted a decade ago. Senior operational staff with grid critical certification cannot have their compensation altered by more than 5% without a full technical review by the Public Utilities Commission. Evelyn hadn't done a technical review. She had done a spreadsheet audit. Tell Evelyn I'm not resigning, I said to the assistant. I'm terminating my contract for cause. And tell her to keep Julian away from the Gibson Substation. The harmonics are drifting again. As I walked out of the lobby, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Leo. Adam, Julian just deleted the manual override protocols for the Northern Loop. He says the AI can handle the drift. What do I do? I looked at the phone for a long time. My heart told me to tell Leo how to fix it. My soul told me to save the grid. But then I remembered the smell of diesel in Annex B. I remembered the smirk on Gary's face. I remembered the 20% knife. I typed back 4 words. Not my frequency anymore. I walked to my car, turned off my work phone, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel the vibration of the city. I just felt the wind. The invisible architect was gone. Now, we would see if the AI knew how to handle a ghost. The first Monday after leaving Nexus Energy was a ghost story. For 15 years, my internal clock had been synced to the 60 Hz vibration of the electrical grid. I woke up at 4:30 a.m., my heart racing, expecting to see the glowing neon synoptic map on my bedroom wall. Instead, there was only the pale gray light of a drizzly morning and the deafening silence of a man with nowhere to go. The exit protocol at a company like Nexus is usually a formal affair, HR meetings, exit interviews, and a handshake. But because I had walked out on a material breach notice, the company went into full-blown scorched earth mode. By 9 a.m., my corporate email was deactivated. By 10 a.m., my health insurance portal showed a termination pending status. By noon, I received a certified letter from the legal department warning me against interfering with operational stability or soliciting former colleagues. They weren't just letting me go, they were trying to erase the fact that I had ever existed. They're scared, Adam, Sarah said as she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her phone buzzing with her own hospital shifts. If you were as obsolete as Evelyn claimed, they wouldn't be sending you legal threats on your first day of freedom. It's not fear, Sarah. It's a script, I said, staring at my laptop screen. Evelyn Thorne doesn't feel fear. She feels risk. And right now, I'm a risk she hasn't quantified yet. I spent the next 6 hours doing what I had never done in my adult life, building a resume. How do you summarize 15 years of preventing the apocalypse? Maintain 99.9% grid uptime. Sounds like a janitor. Managed complex load balancing during extreme weather events. Sounds like a bookkeeper. Understands the ghost in the machine. Sounds like a lunatic. I sent out 24 applications to every major utility in the country. I reached out to contacts in Chicago, Houston, and Phoenix. These were people I had helped during national emergencies, men and women I had shared encrypted data with when their own grids were failing. The responses were uniform. And they were terrifying. Adam, I'd love to bring you in, one old friend from a Texas firm told me over the phone. But I got a friendly heads up from a recruiter. Word is, you're in a legal dispute with Nexus over intellectual property. No HR department in the country will touch you until that's cleared up. Evelyn Thorne has friends in high places, man. She's poisoned the well. I hung up the phone and felt the first real cold shiver of panic. Blacklisted. While I was being choked out of the industry, Nexus Energy was beginning its own slow-motion collapse. I didn't need access to their servers to know it. I could see it in the world around me. I spent my afternoons at a local coffee shop that sat directly across from a major Nexus step-down substation. I sat there with a handheld frequency counter, a device no larger than a smartphone that measures the health of the electricity coming out of the wall. On Tuesday, the frequency was a rock-steady 60.00 Hz. On Wednesday, it started to flutter, 60.05, 59.94, 60.02. To a layman, that's nothing. To me, it was a heartbeat with an arrhythmia. It meant Julian, sitting in my chair on the 42nd floor, had begun optimizing. He was likely pushing the transformers past their thermal limits to save on redundant cooling costs. By Thursday, the cracks became visible to the public. The local news reported a minor equipment malfunction that caused a 2-hour blackout in the downtown business district. Nexus released a statement blaming aging infrastructure and announcing an accelerated modernization plan. I knew better. It wasn't the infrastructure. The infrastructure was fine. It was the management of the load. They were treating the grid like a computer network, something you can just reboot if it glitches. But a power grid is a physical beast. If you surge a 50-year-old transformer too hard, you don't just get a glitch, you get a rain of molten copper. Leo called me that night from a burner phone. He sounded like he was hiding in a closet. Adam, it's a nightmare, he whispered. Julian fired the Gibson maintenance crew. He said the AI predicted that the coolant bubble wouldn't return for another 6 months. But the harmonics are screaming, Adam. I can hear the Gibson unit vibrating from 5 miles away. I tried to tell Evelyn, and she told me if I didn't trust the data-driven model, I could join you in the unemployment line. Leo, listen to me, I said, my voice urgent. Get out of the command center. If Gibson goes, it's going to trigger a negative sequence trip. The feedback loop will fry the consoles. I can't leave, Adam. I have a family. I have to stay. I closed my eyes. Then don't touch the manual overrides. If the AI fails, let it fail. If you try to fix it manually without the feel for the sync, you'll be the one they blame for the explosion. I hung up, my hand shaking. I was watching my life's work being dismantled by a man with a kale smoothie and a woman with a spreadsheet. That Friday, I hit rock bottom. Sarah came home and found me in the dark, staring at the frequency counter. It was reading 59.88 Hz. The city was struggling to keep its pulse. Gary called, she said quietly. I'm not taking the property manager job, Sarah. He didn't call about the job. He called to tell me that Nexus is planning to sue us for trade secret theft. They claim the algorithms you wrote in your garage belong to them. I stood up, the rage finally bubbling over. I wrote those codes on my own time, on my own hardware. They have nothing. It doesn't matter what they have, Adam. They have a legal budget of $10 million. We have 3 months of mortgage payments. They don't have to win. They just have to keep us in court until we're homeless. I looked at the city lights through our window. They were flickering, a rhythmic, hypnotic dimming that only a dispatcher would notice. The ghost was angry. I grabbed my jacket. Where are you going? Sarah asked. To see a woman about a war, I said. I drove 30 miles to a nondescript office park in the suburbs. This was the headquarters of Apex Power and Light. For a decade, Apex had been the little brother of the industry, a renewable energy startup that Nexus had bullied, sued, and blocked at every turn. I walked into the lobby. The receptionist looked at me, then at the faded Nexus logo on my old jacket. I'm Adam, I said. I'm the man who kept Apex out of the central grid for 10 years. I'd like to speak to Diana. Tell her I'm ready to show her how to take it all back. 5 minutes later, the doors opened. Diana, the CEO of Apex, didn't look like Evelyn Thorne. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and her hands were stained with circuit board solder. She looked at me for a long time, then smiled. The invisible architect, she said. I heard Evelyn Thorne threw you in a basement. She did, I said. And now I'm going to show you how to turn her lights off. Sit down, Adam, Diana said, kicking a chair toward me. Start from the dumb part. Why did you wait so long to call? As I sat down, the frequency counter in my pocket buzzed. 59.82 Hz. The countdown had begun. Nexus was bleeding out, and for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't going to stop the wound. I was going to sharpen the blade. The transition from a state-protected expert to a corporate insurgent is not a quick leap, it is a slow, grinding crawl through a desert of doubt. For 3 months, I lived a double life. To the world, and to the legal process servers who arrived at my door with depressing regularity, I was an unemployed man with a legacy skill set, slowly losing his grip on the middle class. But inside the glass and steel laboratory of Apex Power and Light, I was the man building a guillotine. They filed an injunction, Sarah told me one Tuesday morning, dropping a stack of legal documents onto the breakfast table. The rustle of the paper sounded like dry leaves. They're asking the court to seize your personal laptop. They say the ghost code is a derivative work of Nexus property. I didn't look up from my coffee. Let them have the laptop, Sarah. It's encrypted with a 256-bit rotating key. By the time their IT guys crack it, the hardware will be as obsolete as they think I am. Adam, we're down to the last $4,000 in savings, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper so Toby wouldn't hear. Gary called again. He's telling everyone in the family that you've had a nervous breakdown. He's offering to buy our equity in the house to help us out. Tell Gary to go to hell, I said, finally looking at her. And tell him to keep his lights on while he still can. The desert doesn't last forever. Working at Apex was like stepping into a different dimension. At Nexus, the culture was one of control and command. At Apex, it was agility and chaos. Diana, the CEO, didn't want a manager, she wanted a warlord. Nexus owns 80% of the transmission lines, Diana said, pointing to a holographic map of the state's energy infrastructure. We have the solar farms, we have the wind turbines, and we have the best battery storage in the country. But we can't get our power to the people because Nexus blocks our interconnect requests every time we try to plug into their grid. They call it stability risk. It's not a stability risk, I said, tracing a line on the map. It's a bottleneck they created on purpose. They're running their lines at 110% capacity to keep the margins high. If you plug in a single megawatt of Apex green energy, their old transformers will trip because they don't know how to handle variable frequency input. So how do we break in? Diana asked. We don't break in, I replied. We wait for the door to fall off its hinges. And looking at the harmonics coming out of the Gibson Substation today, the hinges are about to melt. The desert months were a test of endurance. I spent 18 hours a day writing a new language, a bridge protocol called Aegis. It was designed to sit between a clean, modern energy source and a dirty, decaying grid. It was the ghost on steroids. It could sense a surge 3 minutes before it happened and dampen the vibration by shifting the phase of the electricity in real time. But while I built the future, the present was a nightmare. I had to take a job at a local hardware store to keep the bills paid without triggering non-compete alarms. I went from managing a multi-billion-dollar energy web to explaining the difference between Phillips and flathead screws to people who didn't know how to change a light bulb. One afternoon, Gary walked into the store. He was wearing a tailored suit that cost more than my car, and he looked at me behind the counter with a smirk that made my skin crawl. Well, Gary said, leaning on the counter. The invisible architect has been reduced to all 7. How the mighty have fallen, Adam. Sarah told me you were doing consulting. I didn't realize consulting involved mixing paint. What do you want, Gary? I asked, my grip tightening on a can of primer. I'm moving into the new development on the north side. Nexus just signed a deal to provide premium tier energy to the complex. I need some high-end outdoor lighting. I figured I'd give you the commission, for old time's sake. The north side development? I asked, a cold smile forming on my face. The one built right next to the Gibson hub? That's the one. Why? Nothing, I said, ringing up his order. Just make sure you buy a lot of candles, Gary. You're going to need them. He laughed, tossed a business card at me, and walked out. He didn't see the frequency counter on the shelf behind me. It was humming. 59.75 Hz. The grid was struggling to breathe. The premium tier energy he was so proud of was being fed by a transformer that was currently vibrating itself into a coma. Back at Apex, Diana was getting nervous. Adam, Nexus just filed a petition with the Utilities Commission to shut us down. They're claiming our wind farm in the west is backfeeding dirty electricity into their lines. They want a court order to disconnect us by the end of the month. Let them file, I said. The storm is coming. Have you seen the weather report? A heat dome? Diana asked. We get those every year. Not like this one, I said, pointing to the satellite data on the screen. A 105-degree spike combined with 90% humidity. It's a supersaturation event. Everyone in the city is going to turn their AC to max at the exact same time. Usually, Nexus would handle it by firing up the old coal peaker plants. But Evelyn Thorne decommissioned those last month to save on carbon credits. They're running without a safety net, Diana whispered. No, I corrected. They're running on a safety net made of wet paper. And Julian is the one holding the scissors. The final blow of the desert months came when Leo called me. He wasn't hiding in a closet this time. He was in his car, driving away from the city. I quit, Adam, Leo said, his voice shaking. Evelyn ordered us to bypass the thermal sensors on the Gibson unit. She said the AI model showed that the sensors were giving false positives and slowing down the throughput. I told her she was going to kill someone. She told me I was unfit for a leadership-driven environment. You did the right thing, Leo, I said. The harmonics, Adam. They've moved from a hum to a scream. You can hear it through the ground. The whole north side is vibrating. I hung up and looked at Diana. It's time. Deploy Aegis to our substations. Set the buffers to absorption mode. We aren't just going to survive this blackout, we're going to be the only ones with the lights on. The desert months were over. The sand was shifting. And as the sun began to beat down on the city with a merciless, unnatural heat, I realized that the 20% they took from me was about to cost them everything. I sat in the Apex Command Center, the war room, and watched the Gibson Substation marker on the map. It was glowing a violent, angry purple. Evelyn, I whispered to the empty room. I hope you have a really good spreadsheet for what happens next. The air inside the Apex Power headquarters felt different than the tomb-like silence of Nexus. It felt like a hangar housing a prototype jet, electric, frantic, and dangerous. While Nexus was busy filing lawsuits to protect their legacy, we were building a grid killer. Not a weapon to destroy, but a system so efficient it would make the old world look like a candle in a hurricane. They think in straight lines, I told Diana as we stood over the central server rack. Nexus sees the grid as a pipe. Water goes in, water comes out. If the pipe is full, they just increase the pressure. But electricity isn't water. It's a collective consciousness of electrons. If you don't respect their rhythm, they revolt. My new system, Aegis, was the culmination of everything Evelyn Thorne had called worthless. It was a decentralized load-balancing AI, but unlike Julian's model, it wasn't built on market averages. It was built on the ghost. I had spent weeks feeding it the last 15 years of my personal logs, every vibration, every harmonic drift, and every thermal anomaly I had ever felt through the soles of my boots. The key is the buffer, I explained, pointing to the glowing blue nodes on the Aegis interface. Nexus has no storage. They generate and they dump. When the Gibson hub gets overwhelmed, it has nowhere to send the excess energy except back into the lines, which creates heat. Aegis uses our battery arrays to act as a lung. We breathe in the excess, stabilize the frequency, and breathe it back out as clean phase power. But building the software was only half the battle. We needed the hardware. Under the cover of night, I coordinated with Apex's field teams. We weren't just installing solar panels, we were installing edge processors on every transformer in our small but growing territory. While I was technically blacklisted, my field reputation was still gold. Linesmen I had worked with for a decade, men who were now being squeezed by Evelyn's efficiency mandates, were quietly leaking me the technical specs of the Nexus interface. Adam, if they catch us handshaking with their lines without a formal interconnect agreement, they'll have the FBI at the door, Diana warned. They won't catch us, I said. Because by the time they notice the Aegis handshake, their own systems will be screaming too loud for them to hear anything else. The psychological toll of the desert months was finally being replaced by the cold, calculated high of emission. But the outside world was still closing in. I was sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, eating a stale sandwich, a far cry from the granola bars of my prime, when my phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. Adam? The voice was familiar. It was Owen, the CFO who had sat beside Evelyn during my salary execution. He sounded breathless, his voice pitched in a low, paranoid tone. Owen? I'm surprised you haven't blocked my number along with my health insurance, I said. Listen to me. I'm calling from a personal cell. They're falling apart, Adam. The Gibson substation has been running in the red zone for 72 hours. The AI Julian installed is suppressing the alarms, but the physical equipment is warping. I've seen the maintenance logs. The cooling oil is carbonizing. Why tell me, Owen? Call Evelyn. She's the one who wanted a data-driven future. She won't listen. She's obsessed with the quarterly report. She's already booked a victory gala for next week to celebrate the 25% operational cost reduction. If the grid holds until Friday, she gets a 6-figure bonus. She's literally gambling with the state's infrastructure. Then let it burn, I said, my voice cold. Adam, there are kids in the North Side Hospital. There are elderly care centers. If Gibson goes, it's not just a blackout. It's a total surge. It'll fry everything plugged into the wall. It's a catastrophe. I know, I said. I told her. She called me a legacy thinker. Now, she's going to find out what happens when the legacy stops thinking for her. I hung up. My heart was pounding. I wasn't a monster, I didn't want the city to suffer. But I knew the physics. You cannot save a system that refuses to be saved. The only way to protect the people was to provide a lifeboat. Aegis was that lifeboat. Back at the Apex War Room, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. We had successfully shadow mapped the entire north side grid. We knew exactly where the Nexus lines were weakest. Diana, I said, my eyes fixed on the screen. We're ready. When Gibson fails, and it will fail within the next 48 hours, the Nexus grid will go into a voltage collapse. Usually, that would pull the whole region into darkness. But with Aegis, we can island our sectors. We'll disconnect from the dying Nexus grid in microseconds and run on our own clean loop. And the customers? Diana asked. They're still contracted to Nexus. Not for long, I said. There's a force majeure clause in every energy contract. If the provider fails to maintain grid integrity for more than 6 hours, the customer has the right to switch to an emergency provider immediately. We'll be the only provider left standing. That night, the supersaturation heatwave finally arrived. The temperature at midnight was 92 degrees. The humidity was a thick, suffocating blanket. I sat in the dark in my living room, watching the streetlights. They weren't steady. They were pulsing, a slow, rhythmic dimming that indicated the ghost was in its final death throes. Sarah sat down beside me, handing me a cup of tea. Are you ready? The system is live, I said. Aegis is watching. The Apex killer is online. I saw Gary today, she said. He was complaining that his smart home system keeps rebooting. He thinks it's a software glitch. It's not a glitch, I whispered. It's the grid screaming for help. And no one is listening. Suddenly, the house let out a low groan. The hum of the refrigerator shifted an octave higher, then lower. The lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, and then settled into a sickly orange glow. My handheld frequency counter began to beep. 59.62 Hz. This was it. The point of no return. In the Nexus command center, Julian was likely staring at a green dashboard while the actual copper in the ground was beginning to liquefy. Sarah, I said, standing up. Go to the basement. Unplug the high-end electronics. Just in case the Aegis bridge takes a second to stabilize our neighborhood. Adam, look, she pointed out the window. In the distance, toward the north side, a brilliant, terrifying flash of blue light illuminated the horizon. It was silent for a moment, then a low, rolling thump vibrated through the floorboards. The Gibson Substation had just committed suicide. The lights across the street vanished. The neighboring houses went pitch black. The hum of the city, the sound I had monitored for 15 years, simply stopped. But in our house, the lights flickered for exactly 0.5 seconds, turned to crisp, bright white, and stayed on. I looked at my phone. A notification from the Apex War Room, Aegis active. Islanding complete. North loop stabilized, Apex sector only. I picked up my keys. Where are you going? Sarah asked. To the office, I said. The invisible architect needs to take a phone call. I have a feeling the price of my legacy just went through the roof. The blue flash on the horizon wasn't just an electrical arc, it was the funeral pyre of Evelyn Thorne's data-driven future. As I drove toward the Apex War Room, the city was a graveyard of shadows. Streetlights stood like dead sentinels. Traffic signals were dark, leading to a chaotic, low-speed tangle of cars at every intersection. But as I crossed the invisible line into the Apex sector, the world transformed. The lights were on. The gas stations were pumping. The grocery stores were humming. It was an oasis of order in a desert of failure. My system, Aegis, wasn't just working, it was holding the line with the cold precision of a diamond. I walked into the Apex War Room, and the atmosphere was electric. Diana was standing in front of the main monitor, which was split into two halves. The left side, representing the Nexus grid, was a chaotic mess of flat lines and error 404 pings. The right side, the Apex Island, was a steady, rhythmic pulse of blue. Adam, you were right to the millisecond, Diana said, her eyes wide as she tracked the data. Gibson didn't just trip, it melted. The feedback loop surged back into the Nexus central hub. We're hearing reports that their main server bank, the one Julian used for the AI, just had a hardware heart attack. It's called a voltage collapse, I said, pulling up the thermal logs. When the main hub loses its sense of sync, it tries to grab power from everywhere at once. It's like a drowning man pulling his rescuers underwater. If we hadn't islanded our sector, Aegis would have been dragged down with them. Suddenly, the emergency hotline, the secure line that connected us to the state's Energy Oversight Committee, began to scream. Diana answered it, listened for a moment, and then looked at me. It's the governor's office. They want to know why half the city has power and the other half is in the Stone Age. They're demanding we open the gates and feed our excess power back into the Nexus grid to help them stabilize. If we do that, I said, stepping toward the console, Nexus will suck us dry in 10 minutes. Their grid is dirty right now, it's full of harmonic noise and unstable frequencies. It would be like trying to perform a blood transfusion from a patient with a lethal infection. We have to stay islanded until Nexus isolates their failure points. Tell them that, Diana said, handing me the phone. I didn't talk to the governor. I talked to the technical advisor, a man I'd known for years. Jim, it's Adam. Don't let them open the interties. If you plug Apex into Nexus right now, you'll fry the only working power source in the state. Tell the governor that Nexus needs to go to black start protocols. They have to rebuild from zero. Adam? Is that you? Jim's voice was frantic. Thank God. Nexus is a madhouse. Evelyn Thorne is in the command center screaming at the techs to force restart the North Loop. They've already blown 2 more transformers trying to do it. She's trying to save her bonus, Jim. She's not trying to save the grid. Tell her to stop, or she'll burn out the underground cables, and then you're looking at months of repairs, not days. While I was on the phone, the cracks at Nexus weren't just technical, they were human. Back at Nexus HQ, the command center was a scene of pure, unadulterated panic. With the main AI servers fried, Julian was standing in front of the dark monitors like a child lost in a forest. The model didn't account for a triple-phase failure. Julian shouted, his voice cracking. The data said the thermal threshold was higher. Evelyn Thorne stood in the center of the room, her Prada heels clicking on the floor as she paced like a caged tiger. I don't care about the model, Julian. Fix it. If we aren't back online by morning, the hospital contract is void. That's 15% of our annual revenue. We can't fix it without the sync keys. One of the senior techs yelled from across the room. And Adam took the manual logs with him. We don't know the phase offsets for the north side. Evelyn turned to the tech, her eyes burning. Then find them. Call the logistics annex. Check the basement. He must have left something. We checked, ma'am, the tech said, his voice dripping with bitterness. The only thing he left in that basement was a stack of empty spark plug boxes and a note that says good luck with the harmonics. The cracks were widening. By 11 p.m., the first lawsuits were being filed, not by Nexus, but against them. The Northside Hospital, running on failing generators because of the surge, had issued a formal notice of gross negligence. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Adam. It's Owen. She's looking for someone to blame. She's already telling the board that you sabotaged the system before you left. She's trying to get a warrant for your arrest to distract from the Gibson explosion. I showed the text to Diana. Let her try, Diana said. We have every log from the last 3 months. We have the warnings you sent to Leo. We have the proof that they bypassed the thermal sensors. If she wants a war in the courtroom, she's bringing a knife to a nuclear standoff. But I wasn't thinking about the courtroom. I was thinking about the city. Diana, I said, looking at the map. The Nexus Central Hub is starting to overheat. If it goes, the black start becomes impossible. The whole state goes dark for a month. We need to do something they won't expect. What? We're going to siphon their customers, I said. Not by force, but by invitation. We're going to use the Aegis bridge to offer emergency backup to the critical zones. We'll save the hospitals, but we'll do it through our system, on our terms. Nexus will still be dark, but the city will breathe. That's a hostile takeover of their infrastructure, Adam. No, I said, a cold, satisfied smile crossing my face. It's market optimization. Evelyn Thorne should appreciate the efficiency of it. As the clock struck midnight, the city sat in a strange, bifurcated state. One half was a nightmare of corporate greed and technical failure. The other half was humming with the ghost I had captured and refined. The cracks were no longer just in the machines. They were in the very foundation of Nexus Energy. And as I prepared the Aegis invitation, I knew that the next time Evelyn Thorne called me, she wouldn't be offering a 20% cut. She'd be offering her soul. And I wasn't buying. The atmosphere in the city was no longer just hot, it was primordial. By 2 p.m. on Wednesday, the heat dome had reached its zenith. The temperature hit 108 degrees Fahrenheit, but the humidity made it feel like 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The supersaturation event I had predicted was no longer a forecast, it was a monster. In the Apex War Room, we were operating in combat mode. Every screen was a sea of data, but the most important metric wasn't on the monitors. It was the absolute silence from the Nexus side of the map. After the Gibson explosion, Nexus had tried to reroute power through the southern entity. It was a move born of desperation, like a dying man trying to breathe through a straw. They just lost the southern entity, Diana announced, her voice tight. The surge from the Gibson failure traveled through the underground lines and fried the insulators at the south hub. Adam, the entire Nexus grid is now officially unsynchronized. They aren't just out of power, they've lost the ability to even talk to their own equipment. I leaned over the console, my eyes tracking the Aegis stabilizers. It's a total blackout event. But here's the problem. When a grid of that size collapses under this kind of heat, the lines don't just go cold. They snap. The thermal expansion of the copper is at its limit. If they try to force start one more time, the physical weight of the sagging lines will cause them to touch the ground or each other. That's not a blackout, that's a forest fire waiting to happen. Suddenly, the cracks turned into an abyss. My phone, the old Nexus work phone I had kept in a drawer, started to scream. It wasn't Evelyn. It was Leo. He was calling from a landline inside the Nexus Central Command. Adam. You have to talk to them. Leo was sobbing. Evelyn is out of her mind. She's ordered the technicians to hardwire the bypass on the north side. She's literally telling them to ignore the phase sync and just blast the power through the main trunk. She thinks if she can get the lights back on for the 5 p.m. news, she can save the company. Leo, get out of there, I commanded. If she blasts the north trunk without a sync, the phase clash will be like 2 freight trains hitting head-on at 100 miles an hour. The command center consoles will explode. I can't leave, Adam. The security won't let us out. They've locked down the building for national security reasons. I looked at Diana. We have to stop her. Not for her sake, but for the city. How? Diana asked. We don't have control over their breakers. We have Aegis, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Aegis isn't just a buffer. It's a parasite, a symbiotic parasite. If I can push a high-frequency injection into the lines we share, I can trip their main breakers from the outside. I'll force their system into a safe lock before she can blast the trunk. Adam, that's highly illegal, Diana whispered. It's technically a cyber attack on a public utility. It's not an attack, I said, my eyes fixed on the frequency wave. It's a forced mercy killing. If I don't do this, half the north side will burn. I initiated the sequence. On my screen, a blue wave began to pulse into the gray Nexus map. It was the Aegis heartbeat. I was sending a signal through the shared ground wires, a specific harmonic frequency that I knew would resonate with the old electromagnetic relays bill I had installed 20 years ago. I watched the ghost travel through the city. It moved through the dark streets, past Gary's darkened mansion, past the hardware store, and straight into the heart of the Nexus central hub. Click. On my map, the Nexus north trunk turned from warning red to lockdown gray. I had tripped their master breakers. 10 seconds later, the Nexus building went dark. Not just the grid, the entire building. My signal had triggered their emergency fire suppression logic, which automatically killed all internal power to prevent an electrical fire. Leo's line went dead. The perfect storm had reached its peak. The heat was still there, the humidity was still there, but the danger of a catastrophic fire was gone. Nexus Energy was now a silent, dark tomb. You did it, Diana said, her voice filled with awe. You just turned off the most powerful company in the state with a laptop and a hunch. I didn't turn them off, I said, leaning back and rubbing my eyes. I just put them in timeout. Now, we wait for the phone to ring. We didn't have to wait long. At 4:45 p.m., exactly 15 minutes before the evening news, the Apex hotline rang. It wasn't a technical advisor. It wasn't a CFO. It was Evelyn Thorne. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't cold. It was brittle, like glass that had been frozen and then struck with a hammer. Adam, she whispered. Hello, Evelyn. How's the data-driven future looking from a dark office? There was a long silence. I could hear the sound of heavy breathing on the other end. The board. The board has authorized me to make an offer. A strategic partnership. We need your Aegis bridge to stabilize our black start. We'll pay whatever you want. Just, please, turn the lights back on. The price of my legacy just went up, Evelyn, I said, my voice flat and merciless. I'm not coming in to partner with you. I'm coming in to replace you. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, I have some conditions. Anything, she said. First, you let Leo and every other tech out of that building. Right now. Second, you send a company-wide email, from your personal account, admitting that the Gibson failure was a result of gross managerial negligence and not legacy inefficiency. And third. Yes? She gasped. I want you to stay in that dark office until I get there. I want you to feel every degree of that 108-degree heat. I want you to sit in the dark and realize that the invisible architect is the only thing standing between you and a prison cell. I hung up. I looked at Sarah, who had just walked into the war room with a box of granola bars. She handed me one and smiled. Is it over? She asked. The storm is over, I said, taking a bite. But the reconstruction is just beginning. And this time, we're building it with a soul. The perfect storm had cleared the air. The ghost was no longer a secret. And as I prepared to drive back to the Nexus building, the building that had tried to bury me in a basement, I realized that I wasn't going back as an employee. I was going back as the owner of the vibration. The Nexus Energy headquarters, once a beacon of glass and light, looked like a hollowed-out skull against the humid night sky. The emergency backup lights were dim, flickering red like dying embers. As I pulled into the executive parking lot, the same lot where my spot had been stripped away months ago, I saw a familiar white Tesla being towed. Julian's operational consultant car was being cleared out to make room for emergency service vehicles. I didn't use the back entrance. I didn't use the service elevator. I walked through the front doors, my Apex Power ID clipped to my chest. The lobby was sweltering, the air thick and stagnant. Security didn't stop me. They didn't even ask for my badge. They just looked at me with the hollow eyes of soldiers who knew the war was lost. I took the stairs to the 42nd floor. I wanted to feel the heat. I wanted to remember the smell of the logistics annex as I climbed toward the throne room. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom, the scene was pathetic. The board members, men and women who controlled billions in assets, were fanning themselves with quarterly reports. Evelyn Thorne sat at the head of the table. Her makeup had run, her expensive suit was wilted, and the Prada executioner looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 hours. You're late, Evelyn rasped. She didn't look up. I'm exactly on time, Evelyn, I said, dropping a thick leather folder onto the table. The frequency just hit 59.5 Hz. If I don't initiate the Aegis bridge in the next 20 minutes, your north side underground cables will begin to anneal. Once that copper softens, you'll have to dig up half the city to fix it. That's a $200 million repair job. Minimum. The chairman of the board, a man named Holloway, stood up. Adam, please. We've seen the Apex data. We know your system is holding the North Loop. We're prepared to buy the Aegis license for $5 million. We'll restore your position as chief of operations. We'll even give you a public apology. I laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, it was the laugh of a man who finally understood his own value. $5 million? I shook my head. Holloway, $5 million doesn't even cover the legal fees you forced me to spend to keep my own house. And I don't want my position back. I don't work for people who think I'm a legacy asset that can be optimized into a basement. Then what do you want? Evelyn snapped, her eyes finally flashing with a spark of her old venom. You're here to extort us. Just name the number so we can get the lights on. It's not a number, Evelyn. It's an acquisition. The room went silent. Even the sound of the manual fan stopped. Apex Power and Light is making a formal offer to absorb the transmission and distribution assets of Nexus Energy, I said, leaning over the table. We don't want your management. We don't want your efficiency experts. We want the grid. We will use Aegis to stabilize the state, and in exchange, Nexus Energy will be dissolved into Apex. You'll be a holding company for the debt. We'll be the ones who own the hum. That's insane. Holloway shouted. Nexus is a multi-billion-dollar entity. Apex is a startup. A startup with the only working lights in the state, I countered. Look out the window, Holloway. Your billion-dollar entity is a paperweight. The governor is already preparing the paperwork to put Nexus into state receivership for criminal negligence. If that happens, your stock goes to zero. You'll be tied up in litigation for the next 20 years. People died in the North Side nursing homes tonight because Julian bypassed the censors. That's on you. I pushed a second document toward Evelyn. This is your resignation. Effective immediately. No severance. No stock options. You sign this, and I turn the lights on. You don't sign it, and I go back to Apex and watch the North Loop melt on my monitor. Evelyn looked at the paper. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the board members, looking for a savior, but they all turned away. They were sharks, and she was the blood in the water. "You're a monster, Adam," she whispered. "No," I said. "I'm an architect. And I'm tired of watching people like you live in houses you don't know how to maintain." She picked up the pen. It felt like an eternity as she scribbled her name. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye. She just vanished into the dark hallway, the click-clack of her heels sounding like a fading heartbeat. "Now," I said, turning to Holloway. "Give me the master encryption fob for the central hub. I have a ghost to put back into the machine." Holloway handed me the fob. I walked out of the boardroom and down to the subbasement, to the cathedral. The command center was silent. Julian was gone. I later found out he had fled the building the moment the Gibson hub exploded. I sat in my old chair. It still smelled like the coffee I used to drink. I plugged in the Aegis bridge. I didn't use an AI model. I used my hands. I began to tease the power back into the lines. I felt the vibration through the floor. It was a jagged, angry stutter. I talked to it. I adjusted the phase angles. I smoothed the harmonics. On the synoptic map, the gray line slowly began to pulse with a faint, pale blue. 59.6 Hz, 59.8 Hz, 59.9 Hz. And then, I felt it. That deep, resonant hum that meant the city was breathing again. 60.00 Hz. I looked up at the monitors. One by one, the sectors turned green. The north side. The business district. The hospitals. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. The streetlights just came back on. "They're beautiful." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The invisible architect was back. But I wasn't invisible anymore. I was the man who owned the light. The sun rose on Thursday morning over a city that felt like it had survived a war. But for the first time in months, the air didn't just feel hot, it felt clean. The supersaturation heatwave was breaking, and as the temperature dropped, the new power structure of the state was solidifying. I stood on the roof of the Apex Nexus headquarters, now officially rebranded as Aegis Grid Systems. Below me, the city was alive. I could see the distant hum of the north side, the steady flow of traffic, and the flicker of life returning to the industrial parks. The extortionate offer hadn't just been a business deal, it was a revolution. The merger was finalized in record time because the alternative was total statewide bankruptcy. Holloway and the old board were gone, replaced by a technical committee of engineers and community leaders. My first act as the CEO of Aegis Grid Systems was to walk down to the logistics annex, the basement where they had tried to bury me. "Leo," I said, walking into the room. Leo was sitting at a desk, surrounded by high-end server racks. He looked rested, his eyes bright. "Adam. Or should I say, Mr. CEO?" "Just Adam, Leo. Are the new sensors installed?" "Every single one," Leo said, pulling up the dashboard. "The Aegis bridge is now the primary nervous system for the whole state. We've cut the harmonic noise by 40%, and for the first time in history, the Gibson Substation is running at 100% efficiency without even getting warm. The ghost is happy." I spent the morning rehiring the legacy staff Evelyn had fired. I brought back Miller, the cable expert, and Sarah, the safety officer. I didn't care about their utilization rates. I cared about their scars, the years of experience that taught them things a spreadsheet would never understand. But there were still a few loose ends to tie up. That afternoon, I drove to the north side development. I pulled up in front of Gary's mansion. The lawn was scorched from the heat, and several of his premium-tier outdoor lights were melted into plastic puddles from the Gibson surge. Gary was outside, arguing with a contractor. When he saw my new car, a sleek, dark electric SUV with the Aegis logo, he stopped talking. "Adam," he said, his voice lacking its usual bark. I heard things went well for you." "They went efficiently, Gary," I said, leaning against my car. "I'm here to check the service lines. Your complex has been flagged for inefficient consumption. Apparently, your smart home system was drawing so much dirty power during the surge that it nearly tripped the local relay." Gary looked at his house, then at me. "Look, about what I said. And the property manager job. I was just trying to look out for you." "I know, Gary, and in that spirit, I'm looking out for you. Your property is being moved to a variable rate plan. Since you love the market so much, I thought you'd appreciate paying the real-time cost of the energy I'm providing. It might be a bit of a material change to your budget, but I'm sure you'll optimize." I didn't wait for him to respond. I drove away, watching him in the rearview mirror, a small man standing in the shadow of a house he couldn't afford to cool. The final stop was a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. I found Evelyn Thorne sitting at a corner table. She wasn't wearing Prada. She was wearing a simple blouse and looked tired. Her name had been dragged through the mud in every technical journal in the country. She was no longer an efficiency expert, she was the woman who almost burned a city. I sat down across from her. I didn't bring a folder. I brought a coffee. "Why are you here, Adam?" she asked. "To gloat?" "No," I said. "I'm here to give you a piece of advice. For your next restructuring job. There won't be a next one. My reputation is gone." "Good," I said. "Then you can start learning. You see, Evelyn, you were right about one thing, the future is data. But data is just a shadow cast by the real world. If you don't understand the thing that's casting the shadow, you're just playing with ghosts. You tried to optimize the heart out of the machine. But the heart is where the power comes from." I pushed a small frequency counter across the table. It was reading a perfect 60.00 Hz. "Keep it," I said. "Maybe one day you'll learn to hear the vibration." I walked out of the cafe and into the bright, late afternoon sun. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "Toby just won his first game at the academy. He says he wants to study electrical engineering. What do you think?" I smiled and started the car. "Tell him to go for it," I typed. "The world always needs more architects. But tell him to start in the basement. That's where you learn how to keep the lights on." As I drove back toward the Aegis headquarters, the city hummed around me. It was a beautiful, steady, resonant sound. I was no longer the invisible architect. I was the man who had rebuilt the world, one vibration at a time. And as long as I was breathing, the frequency would never slip. The lights were on. The ghost was at peace. And for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't just monitoring the grid. I was living in it.